We talk about adoption, what the critical mass is for when it takes off. And that's the distinction between the behaviour of individuals, think ADKAR, and the larger system that they're part of, think the organisation. And it's driven by three things: the logic of collective action, the tragedy of the commons, and network externalities. The logic of collective action, that's where a person's adoption actions depend on their perception of how many other individuals in their personal network are behaving in a particular way, i.e. adopting. And this can be good or it can be bad. And as Olson said, even if all the individuals in a large group are rational and self-interested and would gain if, as a group, they acted to achieve their common interests or objectives, they would still not voluntarily act to achieve that common group interest. Does this sound familiar? It's basically what happens when an organisation is trying to get folks to adopt software tools that are predicated on collaboration. So folks are thinking, even though the group, my department, my organisation will gain by using this collaborative system, I'm still not volunteering to adopt it. And this might seem irrational. Why is individual behaviour in a system seemingly illogical? Well, some of it's about culture, but most of it's about a second factor called the tragedy of the commons. And the tragedy of the commons is where each individual acts in ways that are rational in pursuing individual goals without fully considering that they might be disadvantaging the system at a collective level, disadvantaging the organisation. In short, it's where individual rational actions drive the entire system. The commons, disaster. And Rogers gives us a great way to think about this. Think of the use of air conditioning during heat waves. Each individual is most comfortable using their own air conditioner at full power, yet if everyone does so, the result is a power overload that leaves everyone with no cooling at all. So one way to combat the tragedy of the commons is for a central authority to impose restrictive rules, norms or laws, or create a culture such as growth mindset where individual priorities are aligned with the common good. And the third element is network externalities. This is about when new ways of working, say with a system designed to improve collaboration, become more valuable to an individual as the number of users increases. Does that sound familiar? Well, it's interesting to note that for such a system, its usefulness is largely external to the individual. Its usefulness relies on the size of the user community, and that means adoption in the case of collaboration tools tend to be slower in its early stages, but it also means that the factors that act to slow down the rate of adoption before the critical mass is reached actually speed up adoption after that point. And it's useful to think of critical mass in terms of watching while being watched. This is a concept that Rogers came up with. Of course, the answer is excellent change management, but what are the mechanisms that are going on behind the scenes with each individual? And as Rogers says about watching while being watched, individuals base their choice on what they expect the others to decide. The individual's efforts to decide hinges upon watching the group to discern what the group choice may be. The outcome for the group then turns literally upon watching while being watched. In effect, it's a contagion effect that occurs when an individual sees their peers adopting. And Malcolm Gladwell, in his book The Tipping Point, and it's effectively the social threshold in the adoption process. And as the critical mass is reached, the norms of the social system, the organisation culture, in other words, encourage further adoption by individuals. And as the tipping point is approached, just a few more adopters suddenly make a big difference as the rate of adoption rapidly escalates. But just as critical mass affects the rate of adoption, it may also speed up the rate of discontinuous, or people giving up with the system. Think about it, unlike non-collaborative system changes where it's usually a one-directional influence on adoption decisions, later adopters are influenced by early adopters. With a change predicated on a collaborative system, this can happen in reverse, i.e. early adopters can be influenced by later rejectors. So as users defect, the benefits of the remaining users decreases and the costs increase, and that stimulates further defection, i.e. stopping using the system. And it's also worth remembering that there are highly influential adopters in terms of their influence on others. And there's likely a small number of highly influential individuals whose adoption of a new system might represent a much stronger critical mass than an equally sized number of individual adopters who have little influence. And that means to achieve critical mass, we should get opinion leaders in an organisation active and visible. And if we do that, that means that the communications network structure of the system contributes to the power of the critical mass and the adoption process for any collaborative system. So what are the individual thresholds for adoption? Well, within the context of ADKAR, for an individual, a threshold is reached when an individual has gone successfully through their ADKAR journey, especially getting to ability by go-live day for the system. And within that, it's when an individual is convinced to adopt as a result of knowing that some minimum number of other people with this collaborative system in their personal network have adopted and are satisfied with the new thing. And the key point here is this all means that the adoption threshold occurs at the individual level, think ADKAR, whereas the critical mass operates at the system level, at the organisation level. So what's the lesson from this? Individuals have adoption thresholds based on peer influence, and organisations have a critical mass beyond which adoption will occur and develop fast. Think of ProSci's third tenet of change management. Organisational outcomes are the result of individual adoption. In short, aggregated individual decisions make up the critical mass in a system. So then you might think, why do individuals adopt prior to critical mass, particularly early adopters and innovators, especially when the perceived cost of adoption outweighs its perceived relative advantage? Well, it turns out that the threshold for adoption varies for different individuals in an organisation, and the innovators who rush to adopt first have a very low threshold for adoption, and that's due to their high degree of venturesomeness, how adventurous they are. Later adopters have higher thresholds, i.e. stronger resistance, and these are reached only when many other individuals in their personal network have adopted. It's this distribution that creates the familiar adoption curve, with early adopters and innovators, early majority, late majority, and laggards. And it's been shown that network thresholds can be used to classify individuals according to two things: their innovativeness with respect to the system and their innovativeness with respect to their personal network. And this identifies individuals who have adopted early in the overall process but late relative to their personal networks. Two key lessons from all of this. Number one, an individual is more likely to adopt an innovation if more of the other individuals in their personal network have adopted previously. And two, adoption is highly social in nature. An individual's threshold for adoption is reached when a certain number of their peers have adopted. Innovators with a very low threshold adopt relatively early and thus launch the adoption process in an organisation. And by adopting early, the innovators help others who are later at adopting reach their adoption threshold. And while the critical mass and the rate of adoption of a collaborative technology is reached, the percentage of all individuals' network partners takes a sudden jump, triggering a much more rapid rate of adoption after that. And all of this explains how a critical mass occurs in terms of different individual thresholds. And it's useful to reflect that there's a good deal of interdependence among the adopters of a new system, in the sense that adopters influence their peers to adopt by providing them with the positive or negative evaluations of the innovation. And that peer influence usually makes adoption take off somewhere between 5 and 20% of cumulative adoption. This is especially important for a collaborative system in that there's a built-in forcing quality in the adopter to decide a relationship, and that comes from the reciprocal interdependence of collaborative systems. As someone once said, it takes two to tango, or at least two in this case. So, 4 ways to get to critical mass. Well, number 1 is target and recruit highly respected and influential people in an organisation as your first adopters. For example, imagine the CEO champions a new technology. That's an obvious meta-communication that's implied, i.e. the other individuals should adopt the new technology to respond to the CEO's communications. Number 2, individual perceptions of the new system can be shaped, and they can be shaped by implying that adoption is inevitable, that it's very desirable, and having a laser focus on the ADKAR journey for individuals, especially desire, what's in it for me. Number 3, pilot groups. Introduce the new system to intact groups or contiguous groups in the organisation, especially groups whose members are likely to be relatively more innovative, e.g. research and development, for example. And these groups usually represent an especially rich environment for a new system. After that, introduce it company-wide using R&D in this example as a case study and a champion for the change. And the 4th one is provide incentives for early adoption adoption of the new system, at least until critical mass is achieved. So a quick run through adoption thresholds and critical mass. Adoption thresholds are pertinent to individuals. What are their adoption thresholds? And that is dependent upon their peer network adopting. And number two, critical mass. That's when the organisation achieves its business benefit through speed of adoption, ultimate utilisation and proficiency in use. So again, as with the ProSci model, we have the organisational view and we have the individual view. The third element of ProSci's 5 tenets of change management, organisational outcomes are the sum of individual changes. That's how it works. I hope that helped.